We are so thrilled to introduce today's keynote speaker, Kizzy Charles-Guzmán, the Executive Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. We're so inspired to welcome her as a national environmental justice leader and as a committed housing affordability advocate. Kizzy has spent over 15 years in New York City public service, and she's delivered work at the intersection of environmental policy, public health, climate change, and racial equity. She led the development of Cool Neighborhoods New York City, the city's first strategy to address the impact of rising temperatures and heat waves. She's working to ensure that New York City residents are ready to withstand and emerge stronger from the impacts of climate change. Prior in her career, she has also served as the Deputy Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency, as the Director of Climate Change and Health and the New York City Department of Health, and as a policy advisor on air quality in the Bloomberg administration. She's received a US EPA Environmental Quality Award and a Champion of Change Award from the White House. She will be joining us to share her vision and current priorities for New York City, and will be briefly interviewed afterwards by our CEO, Calvin Gladney, who grew up in Brooklyn. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kizzy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I really appreciate that you're taking time to hear me today. And this is a fantastic gathering, and I am so excited for all the learning that will come out of this. Again, I am thrilled to be here and grateful to Smart Growth America for welcoming me. But also because you are people who care deeply about communities, transportation, and housing stability. And quick shout out to New York City, of course, which just ranked #1 for walkable urbanism in SDA's Foot Traffic Ahead report, and second for social equity, which looks at access related to socioeconomic groups. Walking is one of the great joys in living in New York City, and we're proud to be leading the nation in this area. And in fact, as a New Yorker, I don't even know how to drive. So today I want to tell you a bit about what the city's doing to help keep New Yorkers protected from the impacts of climate change and how that fits in with environmental justice, and then explain some of the city's vision of how climate change relates to housing and transit. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. Though I started this role just over a year ago, I've actually spent over 16 years serving New York City. And as you heard Catherine say, developing this policy that is at the intersection of public health, racial equity, and environmental policy and climate. So whether it was in the health department or the mayor's office, I have worked to prepare the city to meet the challenges and environmental needs of coming decades. So I think of myself as a disruptor. I'm trying my best not to be a bureaucrat or a cog in the wheel, but rather a force that is pushing government to focus on climate action. I'm committing to meeting the needs of New York City's most underserved and historically disenfranchised communities. And that is because I grew up in one of them, in Brooklyn. I immigrated to New York City as a young teen. And after I developed an interest in science, I got a gig as an unpaid intern at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, which is one of the crown jewels of Brooklyn, near the museum. And it was only a very short walk from where I lived. And at the garden, I gained firsthand understanding of nature's hard work and the importance of protected environmental spaces. In fact, one of my jobs was to document and catalog the New York City metropolitan area's flora. But I also had to transplant and tend to the tulip beds, because those premium annual Brooklyn Botanical Garden members really enjoyed their beauty. And the garden is just a 5-minute walk from Prospect Park. At the time, this park was considered dangerous and unkept. I didn't experience it that way. To me, it was a place where my community spent time and formed bonds and found respite. And though I wouldn't have used this phrase when I was 15, it strengthened their social capital. So unlike the garden, the park wasn't gated. There were young people, you were allowed to sit down in the grass, you could picnic. It was teeming with large families who couldn't afford the entrance fee to the garden or make time for its very infrequent public hours. The park had families barbecuing, throwing parties, playing ball outside. Now, New Yorkers love to barbecue, but very few of us have space to do it behind our homes. So I was really struck by the differences between natural environments in wealthy areas, suburban enclaves, poorer neighborhoods, urban locations. And these observations along with my formative experiences working for environmental justice organizations in New York and in Detroit, and also in academia, in college and graduate school, really instilled in me a deep commitment to ensuring that New York City's communities can breathe cleaner air, enjoy our natural ecosystems, feel safe, and adapt to changing environmental conditions. Now, I'm a scientist by training, a geologist in fact, and my training is in geomorphology and water quality. So my days of exploring riverine systems in the Midwest are absolutely a lifetime ago. It feels like dog years, but still science informs my work today. I think that putting homes in natural systems that are designed to flood isn't the most resilient thing that we can do. And I'll circle back to that. But because of my personal and professional background, I chose to enter public service to try and build a city where government infrastructure planning and funding decisions don't intentionally or inadvertently expose people to environmental pollution, poor housing conditions, health disparities or displacement, and inequitable access to quality open spaces. My New York City in my head has thriving neighborhoods in every borough. And my office now contains the term environmental justice. And this is the first time that the New York City Climate Office has had the word justice in its name. So what do I mean when I use that term? My definition of environmental justice is that we don't place our climate and sustainability goals above the needs of the poorest and most at-risk New Yorkers. So my office leads the city's strategic direction as it pertains to environment, sustainability, resiliency, but we're focusing in on EJ. We are releasing our strategic plan in just a couple of months, so we're not getting a lot of sleep. This is the 5th climate plan the city of New York has released and the first under Mayor Adams. And in May, we're also releasing something equally important. That's our Environmental Justice New York City report, which is the city's first comprehensive study of environmental justice. It analyzes environmental and climate issues, identifies which communities have been disproportionately impacted by environmental burdens and which are not seeing the benefits of recent investments made by the city. And we're also releasing a web-based portal. The portal will host interactive maps and information on city programs that are related to environmental justice and that city agencies can use to inform their environmental decision-making and can also be used to empower residents and organizers. So we will soon be developing a plan to identify recommendations for better embedding EJ into the city's decision-making processes. So my point is, yes, a lot of my team is really working on plans and reports right now, but I want to tell you a little bit about our approach to climate change, which is the approach that informs all of our recommendations. First, the way we look at climate change is multi-hazard and multifaceted. Multi-hazard means that we don't just look at coastal floods or extreme rainfall, but also at prolonged summer heat and tidal flooding and air quality inside and outside of people's homes. Climate risk can result in compounding impacts to people, and we have to prioritize work that offers multiple benefits to New Yorkers. So for example, a flip-up gate that in good weather is a space for play and social gathering. So you're planning for the future, protecting against future risks, but you are providing a benefit today. So you may be thinking that extreme heat is not a problem for northern cities, but it is. Because of the urban heat island effect, cities are hot and getting hotter, even in northern cities like mine. In fact, extreme heat is the deadliest climate hazard in New York City, causing over 350 deaths annually due to heat stroke or heat exacerbated medical conditions, with particular impacts on low income and Black and brown neighborhoods. Each of those deaths is preventable. In the summer of 2020, severe heat waves coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic, placing our most vulnerable communities, our low-income neighborhoods, those with chronic health conditions, in harm's way due to a lack of accessible AC, and challenges accessing cooling centers due to the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders. So we got almost 75,000 air conditioners into the homes of older adults in New York City, with a special focus on our public housing. They felt safer and healthier. And now here's a compounding benefit. They still have those air conditioners, and now our residents can get money from the state and the utilities to help them lessen the burden of their energy bills. So that's a little bit about multi-hazard. So now let me explain multifaceted. That means that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no silver bullet. We're planning now for a changing climate, but what we need to plan for is healthy communities to do less harm with our existing infrastructure and for infrastructure that can withstand the climate conditions at the end of their useful life. Multifaceted means that we need to focus on increasing economic opportunity, designing for active living and healthy homes and workplaces, and safe and walkable neighborhoods, and investing in awesome schools and senior and cooling centers and libraries that ultimately foster and strengthen social capital that can serve as resiliency hubs and improve our health. So that's partly about space and partly about time. Public space design plays such a critical role in resiliency, and so does time horizon. We have to look at climate change adaptation strategies that are not just long-term, but also short and medium term. And that is why getting air conditioners into people's homes is just as important as building massive infrastructure projects that take a decade to complete. The greatest cost of climate change is human life, and we need to save lives today. And we want to involve communities in the conversation. And that means leaning into their already existing agendas and including their voices, even when it may be inconvenient. Engagement in communities with ample train access and higher average incomes and less diversity can be easy. Engagement in communities that require us to stretch and travel and translate might be less so. But that's a necessity and not a nice to have. And there is another kind of engagement that we do, which is about being smart about how to communicate during extreme weather events and a disaster. So we work closely with a group called the New York Disaster Interfaith Services, which mobilizes faith leaders during crisis. Interfaith partners are crucial in climate adaptation. That's because not everyone looks at government as a trusted source of information. Some look to community leaders and those on-the-ground messengers whom they know personally. So in spring of 2022, our emergency management and health departments conducted trainings on the health impacts of heat and how to stay safe during hot weather. We offered grants to houses of worship to conduct their own heat trainings. We also work with community members through Be a Buddy, which is a resiliency program that encourages community and faith-based organizations to train and mobilize networks of volunteers to check on at-risk community members before, during, and after emergencies. So again, the idea is to keep people safer during extreme weather, but meet them where they're at, right? Good climate work is community work, and community work requires trusted partners. So the city partners with communities, and we are multifaceted and multi-hazard. So I hope that makes sense as a companion. I also wanted to share a just brief highlight reel of our recent work, which just in 2022 alone, we committed to a $4 billion program to electrify 100 New York City public schools, to provide lighting retrofits to 800 schools, accelerate the phase out of very polluting heavy fuel oil, and build a pipeline for a green workforce. We are expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 100,000 tons annually, and to remove over 20,000 pounds of harmful and disease-causing fine particulates from the air. So again, cleaning up our air is climate work for us. We've also launched cloudburst hubs, which are stormwater management projects in flood-prone communities of the city. We enacted a clean construction executive order to lead by example and reduce the environmental impact of our capital construction projects by reducing the carbon impact of concrete. We broke ground on a coastal resiliency project in Lower Manhattan in an area called Two Bridges, which will protect over 30,000 residents, half of whom make less than $25,000 annually in income, and a fifth of whom are over 65. It will also enhance waterfront space and access. And we also allocated over $100 million to plant trees equitably in heat vulnerable areas, guided by our New York City Heat Vulnerability Index, which is a tool that is grounded in climate and racial justice. We've launched the nation's largest compost collection program. We put resilient solar installations on FDNY fire department firehouses. We are helping New Yorkers impacted by gun violence to get green jobs. And we're building publicly accessible stormwater playgrounds to enhance play and to get designed in part by the kids that use them. So look, all this gray hair, we're having a ball, but also we are really hard at work. And Climate change is ultimately deeply intertwined with housing affordability and preservation. In December, Governor Hochul signed a bill that into law that mandates flood history disclosure in rental leases. And that is crucial because here in New York City, 2/3 of us are renters. The reason I believe in flood insurance is that transparency about climate risk before someone purchases or rents a home can protect the city's housing stock and ensure that residents understand potential costs that may impact their long-term affordability, right? I always say that the most sustainable and resilient thing that we can do is to keep New Yorkers in their home and keep their lights on. Every New Yorker we push out of New York City due to unaffordable rents and climate gentrification is a New Yorker whose environmental footprint will increase wherever they end up in the US. They'll likely have a larger home, they'll likely need to drive, take less transit, live farther from their day-to-day amenities, and even have a larger impact on their natural environment. So you may have read in the New York Times that Black New Yorkers are leaving New York. Yeah, the city's Black population has declined by nearly 200,000 people in the past 2 decades. That's about 9%. And we can counter that exodus by safeguarding affordability while ensuring every New Yorker can partake in and enjoy the benefits of our climate investments today. Greater density ultimately increases the ability of residents living nearby to access stores and services without needing a car, and therefore reducing greenhouse gas emissions. High-density housing in already urbanized areas like New York City reduces the need for new infrastructure and for paving over open space. Another link between housing and climate change is the fact that dense, walkable communities support social cohesion, which I've mentioned a couple of times today. But social cohesion is really critical as a component of climate preparedness and overall well-being. Being able to connect to neighbors, being walking distance to social infrastructure like libraries and community centers helps strengthen connections and makes it easier to share resources on community preparedness and emergency management. An EPA-sponsored report found that housing density helps create walkable neighborhoods, supports housing choice and affordability, supports transportation choices, supports community fiscal health, improves neighborhood safety and security by putting more eyes on the street, and helps protect the environment. So ultimately, well-designed, transit-oriented development can also make it easier to access quality jobs, which is a big part of our economic recovery strategy. Countless studies have shown the connection between commute times and overall health and well-being. In most regions of the US, communities of color tend to have less access to jobs via transit. Quality jobs closer to where people live accomplishes several climate justice goals: decreasing reliance on personal vehicles, which lowers GHG emissions, and addressing racial disparities in health and well-being. So in the context of a changing environment, housing stability must be about supporting people's agency to meet their own housing needs. This includes programs that support existing housing stock, including cooling strategies, energy efficiency and flood retrofits, flood insurance, and clean energy. So we must preserve and create affordable housing, and we must increase housing supply in areas that can be protected from climate risks through building and infrastructure improvements. We are lucky that Mayor Adams understands that link between affordable, dense housing and climate change. Last spring, we released the city's housing blueprint, which is a comprehensive plan that focuses on accelerating the creation of affordable and supportive housing and improving the safety of New York City's housing stock. We also pledge in our Zoning for Housing Opportunity initiative to reduce unnecessary parking requirements that add cost and take up space in buildings that could be used for additional homes. Many cities and some states recently eliminated parking mandates. That is great. New York City has the lowest car ownership rate and the best public transit in the country, and it needs to catch up with the rest of the country in prioritizing housing over parking. So look, though it's difficult to talk about, we also have to be looking at our homes in new ways. As we work to seal the building envelope to emissions reduction strategies, we must also recognize that people are living in homes that are unsafe and contaminated, some by mold they got during climate disasters. So my approach to housing is holistic, and that's why I believe that programs that offer low and medium income households, things like solar roofs, should also be offered, like things like solar roofs should also be offered along with roof repairs, because it's not just about lowering their bills, it's about taking a holistic vision of their home. And why offer a repair roof when you can put solar on top of that repair roof? So I think about questions like that every day, how to center equity in my work and my offices. And whether you work in housing or transit or wherever you live, I urge you to infuse equity and justice into everything that you do. To some of you, that means only ecosystem health or economic vitality or safe, affordable transit. But for me, it means not meeting our climate and sustainability goals on the backs of the poorest and the most at-risk New Yorkers. And I take that view in honor of that 15-year-old Black girl who broke a lot of sweat moving the purple tulips to the right bed at the Botanical Garden while her neighbors endured asthma. To make great strides on resiliency and sustainability, there is still much work to be done. We need many disciplines and diverse voices to tackle the climate crisis head on. I am optimistic about our ability to meet those challenges rapidly and equitably for all New Yorkers. And I encourage you to work in your communities to address those challenges with strategies that look at how we live, play, walk, work, and thrive all together. Thank you. Calvin, you're muted.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your personal story. As you heard, I'm actually from Brooklyn too. And as I look at you, I'm like, you do look like the girl with the purple tulips. Totally, totally, love it. Love it. And thanks for sharing your ideas on kind of New York City's multifaceted and multi-hazard approach. I think it's a kind of comprehensive approach that everyone will be able to take lots of insights from going forward. Wanted to get to one thing that a lot of folks have found challenges with when it comes to centering equity in their work, particularly during community engagement. And you talked about involving communities in the conversation.
Yeah.
Many, particularly folks that work in city governments, have to go into communities where there's already historic distrust,
yep,
or they've never actually gone to that community and asked them what they think, what their challenges are, and what the opportunities are. So what would be your advice for folks who are coming in sort of behind the eight ball, whether it's because of reasonable distrust of that community, or just no history of actually having conversations with the community before?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a hard one. Calvin, I would say that ultimately, we can't be afraid to start today just because we don't have the perfect relationship with every community. We have communities in New York City where residents are literally pouring bleach onto our tree beds because they don't want trees. So again, this idea that community engagement can only take one way, one form, it's not really true. I think that we ultimately need to ensure that we have diverse organizations, and that in those diverse organizations, you have residents from impacted communities, because part of that trust that needs to start to be built on the day-to-day comes from having people not parachute in and rather have people that have an understanding of what assets are in the community, not just what hazards, right? We have to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. So engagement doesn't feel like a waste of time to people. Another example I'll use is that people often say, well, how many town hall meetings or how many community engagement workshops did you have? Right. And we're like, no. The last thing overtired, overplanned communities want is another town hall. They have
Right.
stuff to do. We are out here. They already put together a climate agenda. It's online. So my commitment as a bureaucrat, trying not to be a bureaucrat, is to learn about what already exists, the resources they've already invested their time in putting together, and then deliver those things. And I think that that goes a long way, right, in building that trust, because you're not coming in to say, we just want to talk to check this box here that says engagement. Rather, I am putting my dollars where my mouth is. And say, if you're an immediate community, here's our city's investment in this community to improve the quality of life. And by the way, we also want to talk to you about climate resiliency over here. You see what I'm saying? You have to give us something. You gotta give us some, show that we are investing in those communities that we spend so many decades decimating.
You mentioned your personal story, so this is a little bit of an ad lib with the same question. But I think it'd be useful for folks in the audience. A lot of us, when we are a person of color, but are not from the community of color in which we're working, have some challenges in that same community engagement. So did you have any advice for, whether it's an advocate, a nonprofit leader, a government leader, when they're a person of color doing that engagement, but they're actually not from that community?
Yeah. Look, I think that communities that need this type of work do have rich ecosystems of advocates within them, even if it's not from that organization. We have to do the homework. We have to understand who are those trusted messengers. And I think we're trying to do that. So for us, man, I am not standing up in a church trying to be like, I know I don't live here, but I think you should have trees outside. No, we have the clergy. Be the ones that are introducing those stories. We are funding the community-based organizations, the neighborhood associations. We're trying to, even with small grants, even just with training, so that, again, we're training trainers. We have to identify who are those first informers. Is it, the nonprofits, or is it mama in the 5th floor who knows everybody's business, but during a heat wave, she's gonna know that on the 3rd floor, there's a lady that is socially isolated and needs to check. You see what I'm saying? Like, we really need to understand who the trusted messengers are, and that requires work. We don't get to skip that step.
See, now I know you're a New Yorker, you're talking about people on the 5th floor.
We live in buildings, you guys. We also have one
Speaking of
for
the
family
5th
homes.
floor, so I said I grew up in New York, grew up in Brooklyn, and I always tell people I'm from a small town known as Coney Island. And I am often the only person anybody's ever met actually from the neighborhood of Coney Island. But and all of this is personal for me because my mom, who was in her 70s at the time, lived in Coney Island during Hurricane Sandy. And you mentioned the 5th floor. Well, she had to walk down more than a dozen flight of stairs during Hurricane Sandy, and then had to leave the neighborhood in order to get to shelter. And so my question is really about climate resilience and how we better equip underserved communities when the moment actually happens. And wanted to get your sense of what's the most important thing that New York City has done or will do to help underserved communities in those bad moments, so my mom doesn't have to walk down 12 flights of stairs and leave the neighborhood.
Calvin, let me say that I'm sorry she had to do that. Really, that was such a traumatic time for all New Yorkers, but especially those hard-hit neighborhoods on the coast, right? Ultimately, what I would say, Calvin, is that we cannot react. We cannot wait until a disaster to react and to tell people what to do. What we've really been focusing on is the infrastructure side of things, right? And that takes time. We're trying to make sure that people are elevating the critical equipment. The reasons you probably have to go up the 14 flights of stairs because of a power outage. So resiliency means investing the millions and millions of dollars, right, that it requires to move critical equipment up to roofs. We've accomplished that. We've invested billions of dollars in NYCHA across New York City in those impacted communities to make sure that that power outage is less likely. I already know. I got
12, you knew it had to be NYCHA.
I got you. And so this is the thing, right? Like, we have to put our money behind the infrastructure investment, but we also have to communicate better so that we're not waiting until that disaster to knock on your mom's door for the first time. So again, we're investing in climate communications, emergency response mechanisms, community-based kind of approaches, networks that can help residents seek shelter. But again, we have to stand up these programs and practice during blue skies before the storm, so that by the time this happens again, which it will, all storms are meant to be or are projected to be more frequent, more intense. Heat waves are projected to be longer in duration. Like any climate impact is projected to get worse. So we're trying to do that education now, but also making those infrastructure investments in housing. And you know what I'm saying?
Well, one last question.
You're breaking up a bit for me.
One last question for you. And hopefully when you come out with your book called Before the Storm, we will all have heard it here first. Just, you know, I know a lot of folks in the audience are saying, I want to be more like KCG when I grow up.
Nice.
And, you know, it's an ambitious target. And so wanted to ask you quickly, what's a seminal book you've read or an article that, you know, you're like, well, if you're trying to get more into this work, here's somebody to follow, here's something to read. Just what's bouncing around your mind in terms of something that folks should use as a resource?
Calvin, I am not prepared for that question, but I'm going to tell you why. The truth is that you see that long list of things I told you we're doing. I barely have time to read, but I think that many people, especially in this audience, also relate to that. What I would still say is that in this work, this can feel so heavy. It's anxiety producing. I spend a lot of time around young people. I spend a lot of time around really tired advocates. And to me, the critical thing is you have to find a time in every day to touch the thing that you want to see. I touch a tree. I look for a bioswale because otherwise I miss them. I'm going through my day, right? I'm walking on the street. It's easy to miss that we are making progress, okay? And I think it's important to continue every day to root ourselves in hope and joy. And that sounds so fluffy, but ultimately, the climate crisis is a crisis and it feels like we're running against time and the news are devastating. Every time we see a flood, a hurricane, globally, if the fires, the pictures of our wildlife being decimated by wildfires, we can be so depressed very quickly and turn off. I am saying whatever you're reading, whoever you're following, you make sure that you make time in your day for something joyful and to touch a piece of the thing you want to see. You have to connect with that. Otherwise, you burn out or you step back, and we cannot afford to step back, cannot afford to step back. We're gonna go down swinging.
I love it. Let me tell you, just knowing anybody who can put bioswell in an ad-libbed response is just awesome to me. We just all want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Of course.
There's just, the chat is on fire. So everybody is so appreciative of you spending the time. We know we will never call you a bureaucrat. A lot more work to go do, and we just appreciate all the time and effort and grace and space that you're putting into your work.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor. You guys, everyone, just feel free to reach out. This is hard work. I am so proud of all of you for making time to learn and to do this work with this organization. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. And of course, take good care, and somehow I'll see you soon.
Take care.
Bye. Peace.